By the early 1980s, the superpower nuclear competition had shifted from deterrence theory to operational alert routines. Both Washington and Moscow were processing danger through formal systems, early warning radars, coded alerts, and procedure books for nuclear release. These systems were designed to reduce decision time and increase responsiveness. This created a structural danger, speed substituted for certainty. Systems assumed that threatening signals were the start of attacks, not false alarms. In 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan fractured détente and reset threat perceptions. Moscow saw U.S. and NATO policy as intensifying pressure on its borders. The Afghan intervention became a reference point in Soviet threat logic. For NATO, Afghanistan reinforced a view of the USSR as an aggressive, revisionist power. Both sides increasingly interpreted ambiguous signals through worst-case expectations. By 1983, the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces, INF, deployments had become flashpoints. The U.S. deployed Pershing II and cruise missiles in Western Europe under the 1979 NATO dual-track decision. The goal was to counter Soviet SS-20 missiles with short-flight, accurate systems. Soviet leaders interpreted these deployments as not merely counterforce, but as potential tools of decapitation strikes. Strategic context now included advanced missile accuracy, reduced flight times, and constrained decision windows. Simultaneously, NATO's intelligence collection intensified. Electronic eavesdropping, air reconnaissance, and indicators and warnings, I&W analysis were central. I&W worked by identifying changes in observable data that might indicate hostile intent. But this method relied on change, not certainty. The system flagged unusual activity as possible hostile preparations. The insight here is structural. Systems produce alerts because they detect patterns, not because they attain verified intent. Soviet doctrine in the early 1980s emphasized launch on warning. Under this doctrine, nuclear forces were ordered to fire if warning systems indicated attack. The logic was simple. If you wait for impact data, it may be too late. This doctrine traded verification for survival probability. It assumed that the adversary valued surprise and speed. This assumption was reinforced by Soviet experiences in World War II and Cold War planning. NATO doctrine at the time included flexible response. Flexible response aimed to deter nuclear war by offering a range of escalation options. In practice, this meant command post exercises to practice escalation control and nuclear release procedures. Able Archer was one such exercise. It simulated the transition from conventional warfare to nuclear command and control. Able Archer 83, the exercise in question, was scheduled for November 1983. The broader strategic context to Able Archer included a series of tense events earlier in 1983. In August, the Soviet shoot-down of Korean Airlines Flight 007 resulted in U.S. condemnations and increased alert status. In September, NATO announced plans for a more realistic command simulation. Meanwhile, Soviet leadership read Western policy through a war scare framework. A war scare framework treats ambiguous indicators as possible preparations for surprise attack. In such a framework, false positives can escalate perceptions of imminent danger. Soviet political military leadership, including the Politburo and the General Staff, had limited transparency from Western sources. They operated with partial and filtered intelligence. They interpreted NATO exercises not as training, but potentially as preludes to real operations. This was not personal paranoia. It was a structural inference from their indicator logic and doctrinal expectations. Systems did not ask, "Is it real?" Systems asked, "Does this resemble known attack preparations?" Able Archer 83 occurred against this backdrop. Heightened threat perception since Afghanistan. Expanded NATO nuclear capabilities under the dual-track decision. Intensified intelligence monitoring and I&W alerts. Soviet launch-on warning doctrine, codifying rapid reaction. This was a context where exercises could resemble crises in the eyes of an adversarial system. Analytically, the question becomes, when do systems confuse practice with preparation? Answering that requires examining the mechanisms of detection, doctrine, and institutional incentives. Nuclear forces do not operate on intuition. They operate on doctrine, procedures, and automated systems. Doctrine is a formalized set of rules that guides decisions under stress. In the nuclear age, doctrine reflected worst-case assumptions. This created systemic risk long before any human chose escalation. In the United States and NATO, doctrine in the late Cold War was shaped by flexible response and assured destruction. Flexible response assumed that conflict could escalate in controlled stages. Assured destruction assumed that both sides could absorb devastation without surrendering. These doctrines required robust command and control, C2 systems. C2 systems were designed to relay status, orders, and warnings across continents. They process symbols and codes, not intent. This is important. Systems interpreted signals without semantic context. A code change or message traffic spike could mean exercise, preparation, or real attack. In the Soviet Union, doctrine had evolved differently after Stalin. By the late 1970s, Soviet strategic thought incorporated launch on warning, LOW, and forced early decision logic. Low assumed that if warning systems detected an imminent attack, the Soviet command should fire before impact to retain retaliation capability. This assumption was based on the physics of missile flight time and the limits of early warning radars. The shorter the warning window, the more pressure on leaders to decide quickly. This doctrine traded verification for speed. It assumed attack preparations would be visible in specific indicators. If the indicators appeared, the system expected a rapid transition toward nuclear release. Both superpowers relied on indicators and warnings, I and W systems, for early intelligence. I and W frameworks identified observable events, troop movements, signal traffic, radar sweeps, as potential precursors to hostile acts. The system assigned weight to each indicator based on past patterns. Patterns created expectations. Expectations amplified attention to small deviations. Deviations triggered alerts. Alerts prompted human review under pressure. A critical structural incentive was alert posture. Alert posture is the institutional readiness to act quickly. High alert postures reduce time for verification. They assume the adversary seeks surprise. In the early 1980s, both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces maintained heightened alert postures. In NATO, this was partly due to the new INF deployments and conventional force disparities in Europe. In the USSR, it was shaped by Afghanistan, U.S. Strategic Defense Initiative proposals, and perceptions of encirclement. Each side's posture fed the other's threat perception. Intelligence systems also produced signatures, proxy measures of activity. For example, increased encrypted communications among NATO commands, elevated radar emissions, large-scale troop deployments in Western Europe. These signatures were not direct proof of hostile intent. They were proxies that the I and W systems flagged for attention. The systems did not differentiate exercise from real preparation unless explicitly told. Importantly, exercises were designed to test systems, not to deceive adversaries. Able Archer 83 was a NATO staff exercise for command procedures. It included a simulated nuclear release transition. The exercise was realistic in communications and protocols. It triggered the very systems, radar stations, signal intercepts, cipher traffic, that I and W frameworks monitored. In a normal context, realism is valuable for readiness. But in a high-tension context, realism can resemble genuine escalation. Mechanisms of detection lacked intent analysis. Early warning radars detected objects and signals, not motives. I and W systems detected patterns, not purposes. Both systems worked well under stable conditions. Systems were weaker under ambiguous or worst-case interpretations. This is crucial. Nuclear-era detection systems were optimized to reduce ambiguity about events, not reduce ambiguity about meaning. The structural risk was that systems would force actionable alerts absent verified intent. Institutional incentives also mattered. Military staffs wanted to avoid being blindsided. Analysts elevated ambiguous data rather than ignore potential danger. Over time, institutions rewarded caution expressed through alerts. This created an incentive to see ambiguous signals as potentially threatening rather than benign. Systems did not penalize false positives. They penalized missed warnings. This asymmetry shaped internal interpretations. Soviet political military leadership was particularly sensitive to escalation signals. In Soviet doctrine, surprise attack was a grave structural fear, rooted in both history and operational planning. Moscow's leadership assumed that NATO could execute a decapitating strike with little notice. This assumption did not originate from emotion. It originated from the internal logic of low doctrine and the interpretation of indicators. When NATO began planning more realistic transition exercises, Soviet C-2 detection systems flagged this as a potential shift in readiness. Moscow lacked direct access to NATO intentions. What it had were data streams, radar pings, message traffic bursts, shipment manifests. Systems translated these into risk estimates under worst-case assumptions. Under structural pressure, the system saw pattern deviations as possible preludes to attack. In summary, the strategic logic driving both sides combined: doctrine that rewarded rapid decision-making, systems that flagged patterns, not motives, incentives that biased toward caution and alerts, alert postures that compressed decision windows. These systems and incentives did not create inevitable crisis. They created a context where normal operations, like exercises, could be misread as preparations. This sets the stage for examining intelligence, detection, and warning in Able Archer 83. Intelligence systems are not passive recorders. They are interpretive frameworks built to detect change against expectations. They flag anomalies, not motives. This distinction is central to understanding how Able Archer 83 was seen through Soviet lenses. In the Cold War, both sides cultivated complex intelligence networks. The U.S. intelligence community operated with multiple layers of data: satellite imagery, signals intelligence, SIGINT, human intelligence, HUMINT, and electronic intercepts. Analysts translated raw data into indicators, which they fed into warning models. The goal was early detection of strategic shifts. The mechanism assumed that activity changes could precede hostile action. For NATO commands, intelligence was linked to operational planning. When NATO planned Able Archer 83, the exercise included increased encrypted traffic, denser message exchanges, and simulated mobilizations of command posts. These are precisely the kinds of data that I&W systems monitor as high-interest signals. From a NATO perspective, this was routine simulation of escalation procedures. From an intelligence processing perspective, it generated signal spikes in the very channels monitored by adversaries. On the Soviet side, intelligence structures were organized around the General Staff, the KGB, and military district headquarters. Their analysts maintained indicator lists tied to perceived Western attack preparations. These lists were informed by historical patterns, doctrinal assumptions, and previous intelligence judgments. Crucially, the indicators emphasized preparatory behaviors, communication surges, troop and vehicle movements, radar sweeps, logistical dispatches. These behaviors were not unique to offensive preparation. They also accompanied exercises. The Soviet early warning and I&W systems treated increased communications and radar activity as weighty signatures. Because the system lacked access to NATO intent, it processed the form of activity, not its purpose. This is not a human psychological bias. It is a structural feature of indicator-based intelligence. A system optimized to detect early operational signals will register pattern deviations as potential threats. The system does not ask, "Is this routine training?" It asks, "Does this match known preparation signatures?" Declassified Soviet-era materials and later historian reconstructions, including work at the National Security Archive and Russian archives, show that during Able Archer, Moscow's I and W networks reported multiple elevated alert flags. These flags were connected to increased air defense readiness in the western military districts and unusual message traffic from NATO C2 nodes. Moscow's radar sites also reported heightened emissions from NATO-linked assets. In the system's logic, multiple correlated signals increased estimated threat probability. One isolated signal could be noise. Correlated signals raised risk scores. These scores inform briefings sent to the Politburo and the General Staff. It is important to understand how warning models worked. They were essentially scoring systems. Each indicator had a weight. When the combined score passed a threshold, analysts flagged a possible pre-attack indicator. Real-world events, such as the Soviet experience in World War II and U.S. nuclear doctrine, biased these thresholds toward caution. Avoiding a missed warning was considered more important than avoiding a false positive. This asymmetric risk tolerance meant systems were designed to err on the side of alert. In late 1983, the Soviets had already elevated their alert posture because of earlier tensions, for example, the downing of KL-007 and heightened NATO planning. When Able Archer's preparatory activities began, Soviet SIGINT units noticed surges in encrypted transmissions between NATO headquarters and subordinate units. Simultaneously, Warsaw Pact field units detected NATO air activity that exceeded typical training parameters. These were not direct evidence of attack, but in indicator logic, they were meaningful deviations from baseline. In the intelligence production chain, raw data passed through filters and models before reaching senior decision makers. This filtering is a mechanism that shapes interpretation. Each layer, technical staff, mid-level analysts, senior intelligence officers, added context based on doctrine, experience, and organizational incentives. The result was a threat picture that emphasized possibility over probability. In a geopolitical environment defined by worst-case planning, high-impact possibilities carried outsized influence. It is also essential to highlight the temporal compression in these systems. Signals can be seen at specific times, but interpretation and response often operate on compressed timelines, especially under heightened alert posture. The systems were designed to accelerate human review when indicators clustered. This compressed decision time, even absent actual attack data. Another factor was secrecy and signaling uncertainty. Neither NATO nor the Warsaw Pact fully disclosed exercise details to the other. This meant that interpretation operated on incomplete information. Incomplete information increases reliance on proxy indicators. Proxy reliance increases sensitivity to routine anomalies. In sum, intelligence systems flagged pattern changes, not intent. Indicator logic weighted caution over confirmation. Correlated signals raised threat estimates. Alert postures compressed analysis timelines. Incomplete transparency increased reliance on proxies. These mechanisms created a structural vulnerability in Soviet detection frameworks. Routine preparatory signals for Able Archer fed into models built to detect offensive preps. This produced elevated alerts that were passed up the Soviet decision chain, a process we examine next. Able Archer 83 did not create danger because it was provocative by intent. It created danger because it collided with an adversary's warning system at the wrong time. The failure point was not a single mistake. It was a structural misperception produced by interacting systems. NATO ran a command post exercise. The Soviet Union observed the external signatures of that exercise. Those signatures matched parts of the Soviet indicator model for surprise attack preparation. This is the core mechanism. Exercises create signals. Warning systems interpret signals. Doctrine turns warning into readiness. Able Archer 83 was more realistic than many previous NATO exercises. It included more complex communications, higher-level command transitions, and procedures tied to nuclear release simulation. In normal military terms, this was an improvement in readiness training. In Soviet Y and W terms, it increased the resemblance to real escalation. The Soviet system was not looking for proof. It was looking for pre-attack patterns. That difference matters. Under Soviet low doctrine, the most dangerous scenario was a decapitating first strike. This scenario assumed NATO might attempt to destroy Soviet leadership and command nodes before retaliation could be ordered. In that logic, warning time is the entire game. If warning time collapses, deterrence collapses. By 1983, warning time had collapsed structurally. Pershing II missiles in Europe reduced flight times to minutes. This made the Soviet leadership more dependent on early warning and I and W. It also made them more sensitive to ambiguous signals. So the Soviet system had two simultaneous pressures: high sensitivity to indicators, low tolerance for delayed reaction. That combination is a known risk amplifier. The failure point emerged when multiple indicator categories activated at once, not one signal, a cluster. The Soviet warning model treated clusters as meaningful. It assumed correlation reduced the chance of coincidence. This is statistically reasonable in many domains, but it becomes dangerous when the observed system is running an exercise that intentionally increases realism. In other words, realism produces correlated signals by design. Another structural problem was classification and compartmentalization. Even if some Soviet officers suspected Able Archer was an exercise, the system still had to treat the indicators formally. Institutions do not easily override their own warning thresholds, especially in a doctrine that penalizes missed detection more than false alarms. This creates a bureaucratic escalation path. At the operational level, Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces reportedly increased readiness during the period. Some Western intelligence assessments later suggested elevated alert measures in Soviet air and nuclear forces. The key analytical point is not the exact number of units. The key point is the direction of movement. The system shifted toward readiness because it interpreted the exercise as potentially real. This is where misperception becomes structurally dangerous. If one side increases readiness, the other side may detect it and interpret it as escalation. This creates feedback. A feedback loop is the classic Cold War stability problem. The loop looks like this. 1. NATO runs realistic exercise. 2. Soviet Y and W detects abnormal signatures. 3. Soviet forces increase readiness. 4. NATO intelligence notices. Soviet readiness changes. 5. NATO may adjust posture or communications. 6. Soviet Y and W detects further deviations. At each step, neither side needs aggressive intent. The loop is generated by systems responding to systems. Another failure point was the ambiguity of transition indicators. In the nuclear domain, the most important signals are not troop movements. They are command and communication transitions. Who is talking to whom? Which command nodes activate? Which codes are transmitted? Which circuits go live? Able Archer simulated exactly those transitions. For Soviet analysts trained to detect nuclear release preparation, this was the worst possible signature set to observe. The structural risk, therefore, was not simply misreading a NATO exercise. It was the fact that the exercise activated the Soviet model for the most feared scenario, a rapid NATO escalation to nuclear release under compressed timelines. This produced the most dangerous kind of misperception, a misperception that is internally consistent with doctrine. And when misperception is consistent with doctrine, it becomes harder to correct. Finally, there was a systemic visibility problem. Neither side could see the other side's internal confidence levels. NATO could not see how seriously Moscow interpreted the exercise. Moscow could not see NATO's internal certainty that it was only training. Both sides saw external signals. Neither side saw intent. This is the deeper lesson of Able Archer 83. The danger was created by systems that could observe activity but could not observe meaning. Once a warning system generates elevated concern, the next question is institutional. Who receives the warning? How it moves upward, and what actions are permitted at each level. In both NATO and the Soviet Union, nuclear decision chains were designed to prevent unauthorized use, but they were also designed to preserve retaliation capability. These goals conflict under time pressure. The Soviet decision chain ran through multiple layers. Field intelligence and monitoring units produced reports. Those reports moved through military district headquarters and intelligence directorates. Senior assessments reached the general staff. From there, threat briefings could reach political leadership. This chain was not instantaneous, but it was fast enough to compress options during an alert. The key structural point is that escalation does not require a launch order. Escalation can occur through readiness transitions. Readiness transitions are often delegated. For example, increased air defense alert levels, dispersal of aircraft, increased readiness of missile units, heightened communication security, activation of alternate command posts. These actions are not nuclear use, but they change the perceived environment. During Able Archer 83, Western intelligence later assessed that Soviet forces increased certain readiness measures. This matters because it shows the system did not stay passive, it responded. At this stage, NATO and U.S. intelligence became part of the loop. They were monitoring Warsaw Pact posture. They were watching air defense activity and force readiness. So the system now had two active sensing processes. Soviet Y and W watching NATO exercise signals. NATO intelligence watching Soviet readiness signals. This is where the decision chain becomes interactive. If NATO had detected Soviet readiness changes as preparations for attack, NATO might have adjusted its posture. If NATO adjusted posture, Soviet systems could have interpreted that as confirmation. This is the feedback risk. So why was escalation avoided? The first reason is that the NATO exercise remained bounded by internal control. Able Archer was a command post exercise. It did not involve mass real-world troop mobilization across NATO Europe. It simulated escalation through communications and procedure. That limited the scale of external signals. In other words, Able Archer produced realistic C2 signatures, but not the full physical footprint of war preparation. This reduced the probability that Soviet analysts would see a complete attack pattern. The second reason is that Soviet decision-makers still faced an internal verification barrier. Even under low doctrine, the Soviet system needed stronger confirmation than an exercise signature. The system could elevate readiness, but ordering nuclear use required far more than I and W indicators. This is a crucial stabilizing factor. Even high-alert systems often have last gates that demand stronger evidence. The third reason is that Soviet leadership had strong incentives to avoid accidental escalation. They feared surprise attack, but they also understood the catastrophic consequences of initiating nuclear war on a false alarm. This is not psychological speculation. It is an institutional logic of survival. A system can be highly sensitive and still avoid the final step. Sensitivity produces readiness. Final authorization requires confirmation. The fourth reason is that U.S. intelligence and political leadership had begun to recognize Soviet threat perception as unusually elevated in 1983. Some U.S. assessments and later recollections indicate concern that Moscow genuinely feared a NATO first strike. This matters because it changes NATO's incentive. If the U.S. believes the Soviets are highly sensitive, it may choose to avoid additional signals that look like preparation. This is a form of crisis management through restraint. The fifth reason is the nature of nuclear command and control. Both sides had procedures that were difficult to execute quickly, at full scale, without visible mobilization. Nuclear use is not only a political decision, it is a logistical and technical process. To execute a real strike, many systems must transition from routine to war mode. These transitions create large physical signatures, dispersal of strategic assets, activation of hardened command posts, movement of leadership, changes in bomber patterns, large-scale missile readiness measures. Able Archer did not generate all of these NATO side signatures, and the Soviets did not observe a full set. So the Soviet response likely remained in the heightened readiness zone rather than imminent launch zone. This is where historians debate the proximity to nuclear use. But analytically, escalation avoidance can be explained without needing the most extreme interpretation. The system approached a danger threshold, but it did not cross the final authorization barrier. Still, the risk was real because readiness shifts can be misread, and readiness shifts can trigger countershifts. Able Archer 83 demonstrates a specific Cold War stability problem. Crisis dynamics can emerge even when no side intends a crisis. The decision chain avoided escalation partly because the exercise remained bounded. Final launch authorization required stronger confirmation. Both sides had incentives to avoid accidental war. The full physical signature of attack never appeared. U.S. intelligence sensitivity to Soviet fear may have limited additional NATO signals. But this is not a reassuring conclusion. It is a conditional one. It suggests that Cold War stability depended on multiple last gates holding simultaneously. And that is a fragile form of stability. The broad consensus among historians is that Able Archer 83 intensified Soviet threat perception. The disagreement is about how close that perception came to triggering nuclear use readiness. This distinction matters because it changes the interpretation of Cold War stability. Was this a near miss, or was it a serious but controlled alert response? One area of disagreement is the Soviet readiness level. Some accounts emphasize that Soviet forces, including nuclear-capable units, moved into higher alert states. Other interpretations argue that the evidence shows precautionary readiness rather than imminent launch preparation. The difference often comes from source limitations. Many Soviet archival materials remain incomplete or inaccessible. Western intelligence assessments are also not perfect. They infer Soviet posture from external signatures. So the debate is partly methodological. It is about what evidence counts as near launch. A second disagreement concerns Soviet leadership belief. Did senior leaders genuinely think a NATO first strike was plausible during Able Archer, or did they treat it as a worst-case scenario requiring precautionary readiness? In indicator-based systems, these two states can look similar. A leadership can be uncertain, but still order elevated readiness because the cost of being wrong is catastrophic. This makes retrospective interpretation difficult. The system's behavior does not cleanly reveal the leadership's confidence. A third disagreement involves U.S. awareness at the time. Some narratives suggest U.S. leaders were surprised later by how seriously the Soviets reacted. Other interpretations argue that U.S. intelligence had already detected Soviet war scare logic earlier in 1983 and understood the risk environment. This matters because it affects whether Able Archer was an avoidable hazard. If U.S. officials understood Soviet sensitivity, the exercise design looks riskier. If they did not, it looks like a structural accident. A fourth disagreement is about the causal weight of Able Archer versus the wider 1983 war scare environment. Able Archer did not occur in isolation. It occurred after Afghanistan, INF deployments, KAL-007, and intensified intelligence collection. Some historians argue Able Archer was a trigger. Others argue it was only one data point in an already elevated Soviet threat model. Analytically, both can be true. Able Archer may not have created the fear, but it may have activated it. A fifth disagreement is about how to interpret the incident in deterrence theory. Classic deterrence theory often assumes rational actors with stable perceptions. Able Archer shows that stability can be undermined by institutional processing of ambiguous signals. This is not irrationality. It is system logic. Able Archer proves several structural lessons about Cold War stability. First, nuclear stability depended on interpretation systems, not just weapons. Weapons created destructive capacity, but interpretation systems determined whether leaders believed war was starting. Second, Realism and exercises can be destabilizing. Exercises are designed to prepare forces for worst-case scenarios, but adversaries observe them through warning frameworks. If those frameworks are sensitive, realism increases risk. Third, indicators and warning systems generate false positives under tension. They are built to detect early signals. Early signals are ambiguous by nature. When doctrine rewards rapid decision-making, false positives become more consequential. Fourth, doctrine creates vulnerability by compressing time. Launch on warning reduces survivability risk, but it increases misperception risk. It turns ambiguous warning into urgent decision pressure. Fifth, crisis risk can emerge without hostile intent. Able Archer was not a deliberate provocation, yet it generated a crisis-like dynamic because systems reacted to systems. Finally, Able Archer highlights the fragility of peace in the late Cold War. Stability was not a steady state. It was an ongoing process of avoiding feedback loops. The incident shows that Cold War danger often came from the structure of nuclear competition, compressed timelines, incomplete information, proxy indicators, doctrinal sensitivity, institutional incentives to avoid missed warnings. In that sense, Able Archer 83 is not only a historical episode. It is a case study in how modern high-speed strategic systems can create risk through misinterpretation. It demonstrates a central Cold War paradox. The more both sides tried to ensure deterrence through readiness, the more they increased the probability of accidental escalation through perception.